How do you understand someone who hates your guts? The answer might just be a little anthropology. Welcome back to Anthropology 10 or Less. I'm your host, Michael Kilman. And today we're going to talk about diversity and one method that might just help you understand difference. The truth of the world, of culture, of history is it's complicated. And speaking of complicated, one of the inspirations for this episode came about over a year ago when I stumbled upon this survey of numbers. Question: should schools in America teach Arabic numerals as part of their curriculum? 56% of respondents said no. I told myself this couldn't be real, so I fact-checked the survey with Snopes. Turns out it was real. It was shocking to me to see how many people said no, because if you don't know this already, our system is based entirely on Arabic numerals. Many of the core concepts of advanced mathematics come from the Arab-Hindu world during the 11th and 12th century. Algebra, algorithms, and alchemy, the precursor to chemistry, all coalesced during the golden age of Islam, when Europeans were messing around with that awful Roman numeral system that didn't even have a concept of zero, but for some reason we still use it at the end of all of our films. And that's exactly the point of this episode, because our modern world is only possible because of diversity. Because people from different cultures, religions, and political backgrounds figured out how to talk to one another. Diversity, it turns out, is absolutely vital for science and technology to flourish. I'm speaking from November of 2020 in the United States. The election just ended. Biden is president-elect, but barely won. In the last year, we in the United States have undergone some radical changes. Between COVID-19 and the overwhelming and important rallying cry over race and racism in our justice system, we've had a lot to chew on about the very serious problems in our country, not to mention the economy and climate change. But what is diversity, and how do we understand it? I don't think we can really learn to talk to each other until we figure out how to navigate our differences and find ways to compromise on important issues. Social media has made talking to each other really hard. We all know this. There are numerous articles and books and films on this very topic. So this episode is an attempt to give you a starting point to these difficult conversations. Maybe create a little space and patience when dealing with someone who deeply disagrees with you. And let's start with a mantra that I use when I teach a university course. You don't have to like it, but you should try to understand it. There's a famous quote by anthropologist Horace Minor, who wrote a satirical article called Body Rituals of the Nasarema. By the way, if you really want to mess with your family's head, look up this article and share it, and don't tell them that Nasarema is American spelled backwards. See what they think of this, quote, mysterious cry. Minor once said that the job of an anthropologist is to, quote, make the strange familiar and the familiar strange. But here's the thing. Right now, in our own American culture, we're pretty strange to each other, aren't we? We have to stop and really look at each other, have to stop putting each other in simplistic boxes. No group is homogenous, and everyone has deeply held beliefs that they think are true with a capital T. Sometimes those truths clash, and we can't conceptualize what other groups are saying. It's as if our brains are incapable of processing it. There's this scene that always sticks with me from the 2016 sci-fi film Arrival. The film is about a linguist who attempts to communicate with an alien species, and after the first meeting with the heptapods, we see several people going through decontamination procedure to prevent any foreign germs from spreading to the wider population. In that chamber, a man is being carried away on a stretcher, and Jeremy Renner's character throws up in a garbage can. The main character, played by Amy Adams, appears to be having a near nervous breakdown. Why? Because the experience was so outside their normal world that they couldn't even process it. Sometimes that's what it feels like to come across someone who has a radically different viewpoint to our own. By the way, this isn't saying that we shouldn't trust objective facts or that some differences are there because there are real, deep, and painful issues in our society that desperately need to be addressed. Nor does it mean that everyone will be willing to compromise. But if you give most people the time and space to try and listen and understand, they will. Most people are just trying to live their life to the best of their ability. In a book on anthropology and building fictional worlds that I recently co-wrote with my colleague and biological anthropologist Kira Wellstrom, we came up with a model called the 3 C's. I know. Shameless self-promotion, right? But this is my channel. This model actually came from a moment where I was teaching a university course on cultural diversity. A student asked, how do we understand people who hate us? My response was a kind of first draft that we ultimately refined in our book. We call this model the 3 C's. The 3 C's for understanding difference are context, conditions, and choices. First up, context. You aren't just an individual. You are a contextual being. You were born in a particular moment in history, in a particular culture, speaking a particular language. Culture contains what we sometimes call in anthropology bodies of knowledge. Bodies of knowledge are a kind of network of information that cultures create about history, its values, and its various identity markers and how those fit into society. It's the available knowledge of a given society, and of course, some of these elements overlap in other cultures as well. Context then is the knowledge that we are born into, engage with, and share as a cultural whole, structuring our identity and our perception. But the problem is that not everyone has the same experience with a culture, which leads us to the second of our 3 C's, conditions. These are the conditions of your life. Were you born a poor white woman raised in the religion of Islam? Maybe your parents are first-generation immigrants from Puerto Rico with a successful business that allows you to go to private school. Both of these individuals could be neighbors on the same block, but each of them is going to have a different interpretation of strikingly similar cultural context. Maybe one of these individuals is liberal and one conservative, and their experiences color their perception. Thus, you get difference within a culture. Because remember, no culture, no group is homogeneous. There's diversity within diversity within diversity. And this leads us to our last of the 3 C's, choices. The truth about choice is that most of us, most of the time, don't put a lot of thought into our choices. We don't really practice free will all that often. Instead, we're just reacting to the external stimuli based on the context and conditions of our life. We build all kinds of habits so that we don't have to think about things too hard. Think about how easy it is to zone out when you're driving down the highway. This is because we have something that neuroscientists call a default mode network in our brain. A link is below on this subject, but basically, we put these habits in place so we don't have to overtax our conscious mind by thinking about things too deeply. A lot of these things are built on those contexts and conditions which are further governed within the system of power into which we're born. So while we do have free will, most people reserve that only for the big choices in their life. But then choices, especially big ones, do change the conditions of our lives, and your conditions and your choices can sometimes reshape the wider cultural context. All 3 of these elements are constantly overlapping and working together to recreate your identity and the world around you. Taken together, these 3 elements create what we sometimes call in anthropology ways of knowing. These ways of knowing are how you know and feel about the world. They govern your perception and by extension, color your experiences. Remember our discussion on Sapir-Whorf? That's this stuff right here. Even if you don't subscribe to the idea of linguistic relativity and the idea that your language influences your perception, it's still absolutely true that different cultures have different priorities and different concerns. That's true of different subcultures too. This is both a product of the multiplicity of things, including being raised in a different physical or cultural environment, and having to adapt to different circumstances. Being around different resources or diseases or different spiritual practices, and so on. Of course, there will be differences by someone raised in a small-scale society in sub-Saharan Africa versus some place like London, or maybe you live on a ranch in Montana versus downtown Beijing, China. It's not a bad thing that we see things differently or that we have different priorities, but it is a bad thing when we dismiss people as country bumpkins without listening to their legitimate concerns, or we accuse people in cities of taking things like diversity too far. This is the point of the 3 C's, to step back and think about the relative nature of our experience. You know, cultural relativity. We don't have to agree, but we do need to learn to talk to each other. In a good compromise, no one is 100% happy. Everyone gets something, everyone loses something. And if we want to work together, if we want to make this world a better place, you and I and everyone else have to consider that maybe some of the things you think might not be truth with a capital T. People aren't necessarily pissed off because you disagree with them. People are pissed off because you put them in a box, label them, and forget their humanity. We have to start remembering each other's humanity and that there are lots of different ways of knowing. We have to remember that systems are not people. The world has so many problems right now. If we just attack those problems from the same perspective over and over again, then we will only ever have the same results. The power of studying other cultures, other viewpoints, and attempting to understand the complex ways in which people view and know the world differently is that it is in those differences we will ultimately find success. Remember those Arabic numerals that spread across the world? This happened because for a period of about 150 years, the center of the Islamic Empire welcomed diversity and unique points of view. If we look across the greatest periods of science and learning in human history, we see the same thing across every empire. When diversity thrived, so too did education, medical and scientific advancements, and our understanding of our place in the universe. Diversity is a strength, not a weakness. And if we can stop for a moment and consider the context, conditions, and choices of people's lives, maybe, just maybe, you can build a bridge that leads to understanding. Well, that's all for our episode today. You know, the 10 minutes or less part. But before we go, we would love to make more episodes faster. How? Well, there's Patreon. But also, you may have noticed I've been away for a while. What in the world have I been doing? The answer is writing. Lots and lots and lots of writing. Since my last episode, I've published 5 books, one of which was actually a finalist in a Best Science Fiction contest. So besides Patreon, you can support this page by checking out my other creative projects. Links are below, and we'll see you next time.